My wife Allie told me that when she was younger, her dad Chris got some guineas at their house, and they would consistently roost right outside of Allie's bedroom window. And Allie absolutely hated them. They would make all sorts of noise all the time, and they would consistently wake her up. And so they finally got rid of them. But then Allie, right before her and I got married, she moved back in with her parents. And luckily, this time there were no guineas until one morning at about 6 a.m., Allie woke up because she heard a strange sound. And she immediately knew that it was a new guinea. So she got up, she walked into the living room, and there her dad Chris was standing with a big smile on his face, and he just started busting out laughing. And then he said, "The best part though, Allie, is there's a rooster too." Well, they named the rooster Foggy. Foggy had a bad leg, so he would roost up in a tree, but they had to put a chair next to the tree to help him kind of get all the way up. And over time, it became more difficult for him to do that, so he migrated over to the garage, and he slept on a step in the garage. But the best thing about Foggy, according to Allie, was that he would crow late. It would be like 7 a.m., the sun was already up, and Foggy would start crowing then. Well, this morning we are continuing our sermon series called Light and Life as we look at the story of Jesus according to the Gospel of John. And in this series, it's going to take us all the way up to Easter Sunday. This morning, we're looking at the story of Peter's denial of Jesus before the rooster crows. So our scripture lesson this morning comes from John 18, verses 15 through 27. Before the festival of Passover, Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Because this other disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. However, Peter stood outside near the gate. Then the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, came out and spoke to the woman stationed at the gate, and she brought Peter in. The servant woman stationed at the gate asked Peter, "Aren't you one of this man's disciples?" "I'm not," he replied. The servants and the guards had made a fire because it was cold. They were standing around it, warming themselves. Peter joined them there, standing by the fire and warming himself. Meanwhile, the chief priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered, "I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in temple, where all the Jews gather. I've said nothing in private. Why ask me? Ask those who heard what I told them. They know what I said." After Jesus spoke, one of the guards standing there slapped Jesus in the face. "Is that how you would answer the high priest?" he asked. Jesus replied, "If I speak wrongly, testify about what was wrong. But if I speak correctly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing with the guards, warming himself. They asked, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" Peter denied it, saying, "I'm not." A servant of the high priest, a relative of the one whose ear Peter had cut off, said to him, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" Peter denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. After Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter and this unnamed disciple follow Jesus and this detachment of troops to the high priest's courtyard. Peter is standing outside the gate of Annas' house. The other unnamed disciple, who we think might be John, knows the high priest, and he asks for permission for his buddy Peter to enter. When he's allowed in, a servant girl at the gate asks Peter, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" And Peter immediately says, "I'm not." Right there, Peter denies Christ for the first time. And it's ironic that Peter denies knowing Jesus, especially considering that just before this interaction, Peter pulled out his sword and was willing to fight off the troops when they first tried to arrest Jesus. Peter was willing to put it all on the line. He was willing to die for Jesus. In fact, Peter even goes as far as to cut off the ear of the high priest's servant Malchus. He wanted to prove his commitment and love for Jesus. Peter did what he thought was the right thing. But then Jesus heals Malchus's ear and rebukes Peter's act of violence. In trying to stand up for Jesus, it seems that Peter has let Jesus down instead. And even though Peter has already denied Christ once, it kind of looks like he's in the clear. He's in the room and he makes his way further into the courtyard. He cowers by this charcoal fire trying to warm himself. And to be fair, Peter is in enemy territory. He's surrounded by hundreds of troops. He's outnumbered and he is outarmed. With the exception of himself and the unnamed disciple, all the other disciples have run away scared. No one else is there to be found. So, can we really blame Peter for trying to blend in, for trying to keep a low profile? Can we really even blame him for that little fib that he told about not knowing Jesus? You know, it's easy to follow and accept Jesus here on Sunday morning. It's easy to be a Christian when you live in the buckle of the Bible Belt. But it's entirely a different story when you are surrounded by enemies. It's an entirely different story when push comes to shove and you are put in an impossible situation. Think of the Christians in Nazi Germany who had a choice to stay safe by keeping their mouth shut, or risk being imprisoned or even killed by standing up for what is right. It's when we're put in an emergency situation that our faith is truly tested. And Peter does what many of us, most of us, would do. He tries to slip by. He tries to play dumb. He tries to move forward in silence. Unfortunately, Peter's not blending in as well as he had hoped. As Jesus is being questioned by the chief priest, another person recognizes Peter. Aren't you one of his disciples? Again, Peter quickly denies this allegation. I'm not. But Peter is not going to get off the hook that easily. Right away, Peter is pressed once more, and this time by a relative of Malchus, the man whose ear Peter had chopped off. Didn't I see you in the garden with him? And for the third and final time, Peter denies Jesus. Matthew's gospel even says that he curses at them and he swears that he doesn't know Jesus. But at that very moment, as these words flew out of his mouth, a rooster crows. After that, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tells us that Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. But we shouldn't be surprised, and neither should Peter, because Jesus had predicted that this very thing would happen. Jesus told Peter that he would deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. And now this prophecy has happened just as Jesus said it would. Even though Jesus predicts Peter's denial, at the time Peter refused to believe that it could actually happen to him. Peter thought that he was impervious to this. He thought he was special. He thought he was different. He was a disciple, after all. And I think that we make this same mistake too. Sometimes we think that we are immune to certain temptations or traps in life. We think it'll never happen to me. That's somebody else's problem. I'm different. I'm special. But as one of my good friends used to say, never say it can't happen to you, because it can. This morning, it's important to remember that we are all often in Peter's situation. We are constantly confronted with choices. We're given opportunities to do the right thing for the right reasons, and sometimes we rise to that occasion, and oftentimes, we fail. Like Peter, we might have good intentions, but we don't always follow through with our actions. There are times when we have denied Christ with our words and with our actions. And sometimes those denials have small consequences. And sometimes they seem to have very big consequences. Either way, we're all guilty. We deny Christ when we fail to offer forgiveness and instead cling to our grudges. We deny Christ when we judge our neighbor instead of offering grace. We deny Christ when we have more than we could ever want, but we fail to be generous to those who don't have enough. We deny Christ when we insist that we know better instead of listening to God's voice in our lives. The preacher and theologian Fred Craddock tells the story that occurred during the height of the civil rights movement. Craddock found himself driving across the country. He was making his way through northern Mississippi early one morning, and he stopped for a cup of coffee and some breakfast. He found a small diner in a small town. He decided to pop in. It was early enough in the morning that Craddock was alone in the diner with the cook, and he ordered his food and coffee. And while he was sitting at the counter, another man entered and sat down a couple stools away and ordered a cup of coffee. But this man was African American, and the cook looked at him and he said, "Get out, we don't serve your kind here." And the man patiently responded, "My money is just as good as his." And he pointed over a few stools over to where Craddock was sitting. But the cook continued to point to the door and said, "Get out, whites only." And with that man sighed. He slowly removed himself from that stool and from the diner. Craddock says that he continued to finish his meal. He paid, he left, but right before he was about to get back into his car, in the still and quiet of the early morning, he heard a rooster crow in the distance. When have we denied Jesus and heard the rooster crow? When have we failed to live up to the standards that God has called us to live up to? Even in the midst of his failure, guilt, and shame, this is not the end of Peter's story. This one mistake, although it's a big one, does not define Peter's life. In fact, Peter has an incredible comeback story. The three denials of Peter are often linked with the three questions that Jesus asks Peter after his resurrection. If you fast forward, you see this story in John chapter 21. Jesus is standing there on the beach, on the shore, and he's there with Peter, and he confronts Simon Peter. They're standing again by a charcoal fire, and he asks him a very emotional and vulnerable question: "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And it's interesting to note that Jesus doesn't call him by his usual name, Peter, but he's very formal. Simon, son of John, showing, he means business here. And Peter replies, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus says, "Then feed my lambs." Jesus repeats the same question again. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Again, Peter replies, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus says, "Take care of my sheep." A third time, Jesus asks him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And at this point, Peter's getting his feelings hurt. Why would Jesus ask him this question? Not once, not twice, but 3 times in a row. And a very confused Peter responds, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus says once again, "Then feed my sheep." That threefold question reminds us of Peter's threefold denial. We flash back to that moment where Jesus is there on trial and Peter is standing around a different charcoal fire, and 3 times he's asked, "Do you know Jesus? Aren't you one of his disciples?" And 3 times Peter says, "I don't know him. I'm not his disciple." But now in this interaction on the shore, Jesus gives Peter the opportunity to respond to the call of discipleship once again. That threefold question, "Do you love me?" gives Peter 3 opportunities to answer this call. 3 opportunities to redeem himself. And the good news is that Peter's denial of Christ is not reciprocated by Jesus. Peter denies Jesus, but Jesus does not deny Peter. He doesn't give up on Peter, and he is not going to give up on you and me. There's a lot of people walking around with a lot of shame and guilt. And there's a lot of people that feel like their sin is too big. that they've done too much, that they are beyond redemption, and that they simply don't deserve forgiveness. But Peter's story is a reminder that there is nothing that you could ever do to make God love you less. There's nothing you could ever do to make God love you less. It doesn't mean that we're not accountable for our actions. It doesn't mean that our actions don't have consequences, but it is a promise that God loves us because that's who God is. And God is always willing to forgive us and to redeem us. When the rooster crows in the background of our lives, we can remember Peter's story. We can remember that God's love for us is boundless, unchanging, unconditional. No matter how we may fail, no matter what mistakes we might make, God's love remains steadfast and unwavering. It's not dependent on our actions, our accomplishments, or even our failures. God's love transcends our understanding and surpasses our limitations. We don't deserve grace. We've done nothing to earn it, but that's the beautiful thing about God. He gives it to us anyway. Thanks be to God.